Betancourt is here as chair of our school construction committee, and we have guests from DRA to give a presentation for council members. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. It's a little different for me sitting down here, but we'll go with this. So first, thank you for scheduling this. We're certainly glad to be here. This is obviously a big project, so there'll be a lot to talk about. And I turned my phone down, but I decided to do something else. So what we'll have today is a presentation from DRA, and we'll take questions and answers, hopefully from the City Council, and we'll go on from there. So with me today are James Barrett and Greg Smalley and Mark Jacob. Yeah. So and we'll go on from there. All right. So thank you very much. With that, who's the first up? Jim. Jim's first up. Most of you have seen this, or some of you have seen this already, but there are some updated numbers, so especially on the maintenance aspects. So yeah, you got everything. All right, good. Yeah. And we'll go from there. You should all have the papers, and everything's great.
Thank you, Mark, and good evening. My name is Jim Barrett, Principal, Drummer Roseanne Anderson, South Windsor, Connecticut. This evening, to share the presentation regarding our work. We began about a year ago, and in that work, studying 14 buildings here within Norwich, 7 of them as elementary schools and 2 middle schools. Our work covered several different areas, so I'll cover the first portion of this, which is the backgrounds. I'll speak to our existing building assessments, demographic and enrollment information that has been collected, educational programming, and then begin to introduce the potential options. So beginning with those 4. First, after being brought on board to do this work, we took advantage of last summer and were able to get into many of the buildings through that unoccupied period of time, or less occupied period of time. Through it, an assessment of the conditions within the buildings. This is a range of physical condition that was found in terms of the most suitable of the buildings within the district to the lesser suitable buildings within the district. In terms of enrollment and demographic forecasting, in terms of district total, our demographer tells us that relatively flat for over the next 8 to 10 year window of time. The city population overall anticipated to, again, remain relatively stable with a slight drop in terms of total number of people within the community. So as we look at that in the actual enrollment and demographics information, the yellow bars to the left represent history. Everything to the right in the blue is projection, looking forward 10 years. The pre-K to 5 grade groups remain relatively stable and flat through that period. Similarly, the 6 through 8 profile, once we move through 2025, 2026, again, stabilizes and remains relatively flat. This combination of the district being relatively stable and the growth within the different cohorts remaining stable gives us a good platform to work from and a good understanding of what we have to address. In terms of the attendance zones within the district, this is not uncommon for us to come to a district after attendance zones have been established for a while and find that there are some peculiarities, areas of interest. An example, if we look to the green catchment area, that is Uncas School. And you'll note that if you move just north of where we are in the center of town, there are two other satellited green areas, all part of the Uncas catchment zone. Another that we can look to as an example is the Stanton catchment area. Stanton is the large pink area to the southwest, and you'll note to the east a satellited area which is assigned to Stanton. Other areas that we'd like to draw your attention to, Veterans Memorial. It is the tan color or orange color that moves up and down the western side of the district. And it goes from the very northmost point all the way down and engages Route 2 at its lowest point down there. So it's an extraordinarily large district north to south, and similarly, the Moriarty catchment area has that same kind of profile, an extensive north to south travel within that particular school's catchment area. When we think about these areas and zones, and we think about where are the students, this gives you a sense of density mapping for the district, and that reddish and orange area really shows the larger concentrations of where the students are in the district. And that's the beginning point for us as we think about where are the students and where are the schools as we think about addressing that. And as we look at the current enrollments, two things that we'd like to note. The largest schools, Stanton and Moriarty highlighted in the yellow at the top. The largest of the district over the next 10-year window will get larger. And if we look to the very bottom of this chart, Veterans and Waconic, the smallest within the district will get smaller. And this type of change is something that really moves away from the parity that we'd like to see within the district in terms of the size and scale of schools as they serve the students within the district. So with that goal of better aligning enrollments across facilities, some we find are too small to be effective. They're not fiscally or logically feasible. They don't help in terms of providing parity throughout the district. Some of these buildings, they really do not meet guidelines in terms of sizing of spaces, room sizes for classrooms as an example. And then projected enrollment for some of the schools will stretch these schools in terms of their ability and capacity to meet their future needs. And then when we think about fostering student growth, as we get to an idealized sizing, thinking about parity within the system, a good target range, certainly not more than 800 students, but a target of 300 to 500 students is what we'd like to see, and in that, a balanced mix of students attending each of these schools. And as we think of these community of learners, we start to think about how can we take larger populations and still provide a small school feel in terms of how the buildings are seen through the eyes of the users. So techniques like school within school, or small schools sharing the same physical environment are two examples of an approach. They sound the same. They're actually quite different in that the two schools sharing the same envelope basically are freestanding schools, fully staffed top to bottom, and simply are doing just that, sharing the same physical environment. But each of these gives that opportunity to reduce the overall cohort and be able to give that sense of smaller learning communities. So We will share with you over the next portion of this presentation 3 approaches that were considered. The first was continuing with the 7-school approach. These average about 300 students each. As we look to numbers within this, we approached it purely on a maintenance requirement approach, not really addressing the core needs of the buildings. The 2 alternate configurations that we share, a 4-school approach, which has target ranges of 550 to 600 students apiece, and then a 3-school approach with 700 students targeted within each. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Greg Smalley, our project manager, for that exploration.
Thanks, Jim. As Jim had said, we looked at the 3 potential options, and we came to refer to the option of running 7 schools as do nothing, which is to say that we weren't looking at replacing those 7 schools, but simply fixing them up, addressing past due maintenance, overdue maintenance, and not necessarily bringing them fully into compliance with the educational guidelines from the state, but to keep what you have here, address the physical needs, and move forward from there. All the buildings require some investment, with the exception of Kelly, which is recently renovated 10 years ago and moving out. We don't see much need for investment in that for the next 8 to 10 years, and then systems will start to come up. Now, we looked at, compared to OSCGR, which is the Office of School Construction and Grants at the state level, and wanted to see at 300 students, how many of the buildings within the district would actually comport with the OSCGR guidelines. And you see there's 3 buildings that work, Huntington, Moriarty, and Uncas, are large enough in building size, and Moriarty and Stanton are large enough in site size. So we would be, to follow this scenario, would be investing in buildings that are below the state guidelines. So we're saying in terms of parameters, it's maintenance and repairs. Expansion is not included, total renovation is not included, and the opportunity for state grants is extremely limited with this approach. We look at 2 of the buildings as examples, Stanton, and we use a 2-year window, so immediate need is actually now 2023, and then 2025, 2030, 35, and 40, as you see. And this investment shown on the right of the slide would be intended to take place anywhere in the span between the initial date and the next section. So in Stanton, we're seeing some need by 2025 and 2030 of over a $12 million investment in that building to preserve what's there and keep that moving. And over the next 20 years, now 17 years, about a $21 million investment in that building. On Moriarty, the perhaps other end of the spectrum in terms of building condition at this point, we're seeing forecasting of about an $18 million investment by 2030 and a almost $24 million investment overall. When we go through all of the buildings in town, we end up with, and this includes Kelly, because at this point, Kelly, starting in 2035, some of those systems start to come up as having identified need. But the district overall, about $272 million, and without Kelly, about $226 million. And that's a number to bear in mind as we start to look at the alternatives here. So we went back, and to repeat, we put escalation in this. Project dates can start, work would take place in occupied schools, and work would take place in multiple schools at the same time. So you'll be disrupting quite a bit of the school district as you go through this work, And it has moved away from summertime work. It's moved into real project-type work that needs to be a bit more disruptive than summertime work might be. So we then said, what happens if we looked at some replacement, a new build option? And 4 elementary, 2 middle schools, this would end up with appropriately sized spaces within the buildings. Certainly inclusive, flexible learning spaces that were really part of the program when most of your buildings were built. Outdoor learning and play opportunities, which not only did the schools identify, but also the recreation department identified as a need citywide. Recreation also identified a need for indoor gymnasiums, and virtually all of the gymnasiums at the elementary school level are well below the size for an elementary school nowadays. Only one building has an appropriately sized gymnasium. The rest are undersized, and that is Huntington. And room for special ed, which has been a bugbear for most districts as more special ed programs and more inclusion have grown. And then finally, incorporating STEAM and project-based learning, where a lot of education is moving now. So we did some educational programming with district leadership and got their view on what they would like to see in the buildings moving forward. We looked at the OSCGR guidelines to establish the maximum size for funding. And then we, in working through with the district and with our educational planning side, accommodated some spots that OSCGR may not recognize at this point. So that is the way to say the program that we are basing this on is slightly larger than the OSCGR guideline, which will impact grant reimbursement. So here you see 525 students, OSCGR is 62,000 square feet, the working program is 74,000. It's about a $12,000 square foot increase over OSCGR. When we look at 525 students, you have 2 buildings that have a large enough footprint, Huntington and Uncas, and only 1 site that's large enough is Stanton. The site holds us back less than building size at this point. When you start to try to enlarge or increase these existing buildings, you end up having to take apart quite a bit of it in order to get the types of rooms that you want within those spaces. So we looked in terms of getting 4 buildings. Moriarty, Stanton, and Uncas stood up as kind of circling that population center, but being far enough out to not put the onus on too much travel to get from the outer reaches of the city down into those schools. And then the old Greenville School on Golden Street is right in the heart of our population center. And though a challenging site to work with, its location really makes it rise to the top of what we considered. So in this arrangement, you see a far more cohesive layout of elementary schools with Moriarty at the top, Stanton and Uncas to the bottom, and the new school over to the east. And that gives us a pretty clear run-through of how to get this to work. And that in hand, we started to look at the sites to see if it actually would work. And Moriarty was our first. So taken from the GIS that the city and the state run, we see a wetlands off to the upper left, that's northwest of the building, and some slope across the center of it south of the school. And those slopes are 5%. They're not overwhelming in this case, and it's a relatively short run. We looked at the idea of potentially building on the ball field with a 2-story building. This would allow us to straighten out parking, bus drop-off, parent drop-off, and then recreate, leaves more than enough space to recreate the baseball field and get a rectangular field that is, it's there right now. It's not as well-defined as perhaps it should be. It would also allow play fields or playscapes, playgrounds for the appropriate age groups 2 through 5 and 5 through 12 which that building actually lacks right now. Our next one was to look at Stanton, which we knew had plenty of site. The left side of the drawing, the west side, shows green and blue. That is an acknowledged wetland and flood area. We know that that river that would cause that is piped, and that piping is, we're told, is structurally sound and adequate for capacity. So we have less concern with that area. We do have some sloping off to the right side of the drawing. The brown is 2 to 5%, and the red is more than 5%. But a large site gives us the opportunity to move, once again, the two-story building back onto that slope and get 2 fields established. This allows us to keep this building in operation while the new one is built, similar to Moriarty. And it gives us a much more logical parking and drop-off arrangement at the front of the new building. Uncas has mostly sloped. The west side of the site slopes fairly sharply with the 2 fields terraced into there, no wetlands area. This is a very difficult building as it is configured now for parent and bus drop-off. Very, very tight, a lot of conflicts on the site. The thinking here is look towards the southern side of the site down low for a 2-story building, reconstitute the 2 fields, and more importantly, stretch that driveway and parking area out to address some of the conflicts coming into the building itself. And then finally, Golden Street, former Greenville School. This site very hilly. You can see the lower right-hand corner, that flat brown spot was where the old school was. It does have a number of different ways into it. The city owns out to Bowman on the top and at the lower left as well. So there's a couple of opportunities to get better site circulation onto this site without impacting the neighborhood too drastically. And a 2-story building, field to the top, field to the bottom, parking, and drop off in front of the building. So I think in the long run, those 4 sites give us quite a bit of possibility and potential to build through. So we looked at projected costs and schedule, and we'll have Mark come up and talk a little bit about this, but we forecast including construction and soft costs. Projected costs include escalation, so there's a comparison to the maintenance numbers, and we're looking at potentially 2 phases, and building it this way avoids the need for swing space, which is a cost that is difficult to recoup at the end. So Mark, if you want to take over from there.
Good evening. My name is Mark Jeffco. I'm an assistant vice president with ONG Industries and pretty much build schools for our living. So we had joined the team here to really analyze the overall program and see what the construction cost would be versus, from the program we had shown here versus the other programs that Jim and Greg had mentioned. So in this analysis here, we're looking at the Golden Street Elementary School as new construction. We're kind of breaking down the cost by the overall projected construction cost to actually build the school. What we think is the eligible costs of the overall project, where you get reimbursement from the Office of School Construction Grants. And we also looked at the square foot reductions based on what Greg was mentioning. The schools are a little bit larger than what the state would reimburse you for. But ultimately, we're trying to compare what the net cost to the city of Norwich is for each of the projects. So it's really the net difference between the estimated project cost and then the net cost to Norwich. So with the Golden Street School, elementary school, again, our projected cost was $60,368,000, with an estimated cost to the city of Norwich of $23,768,000. Again, moving down the line here, Stanton Elementary School. Again, we are estimating a projected construction cost of $66 million. Again, that's the total project cost, including construction and soft costs, with a net cost to the city of Norwich of $26 million. Teachers Middle School, again, the overall project cost would be $99 million for an additional renovation. The reimbursement rate is a little bit higher there because it's a renovation versus a new construction project. The net cost to the city would be $32,121,000. And then Huntington admin offices, again, it's not a teaching space per se, but the reimbursement rate is different than the other projects because we're not school or teaching students in school, in that building rather. But the overall project cost of $25 million with a net cost to the city of Norwich of $15,587,000. And then the last two schools, the Moriarty Elementary School has a overall estimated project cost of $64,204,000 with a net cost to the city of Norwich of $25,279,000. And the last school, the Uncas Elementary School, has an overall project cost of $66,761,000 with a net cost to the city of $26,285,000. And really the big item that we have kind of highlighted on the right-hand side of the screen there is the projected construction cost, overall project cost of $381 million for the entire program. But really the number that you really need to pay attention to is the projected cost of the city of Norwich, which is $149,060. And that's after reimbursement from the states.
So we let Mark do the numbers for two reasons. One is the objectivity of a third party doing cost estimates and the amount of estimating that they do and construction that they do in the state gives us a far more nuanced look at the potential costs. Now, part of what's driving a bit of this is escalation within the construction industry has been far in excess of anything else we've seen. Certainly topping about 8%. Construction costs in Massachusetts have gone up nearly 50% in the last year alone. In Connecticut, we're seeing about 24% over the last 2 years and forecasting out at 8% compounded for this work. Comparing that to the CIP, the do nothing option, we escalated out at 8% for the first 2 years and then used 5% after that. So even at that point, the numbers get to be quite different. Part of what we're looking at on here is a two-phase approach, which would start in 2022, moving forward, and would take a fair number of buildings offline as early as December of 2025. And then a second phase that would finish up the last of the construction. And the more we can do in the first phase, the more we save just on plain escalation. So we're looking at two and a half projects. Huntington gets pushed out a bit because we need a space for teachers, middle school, when that building gets renovated. So we're looking at perhaps Huntington serving as a middle school for a little while, but that's a nuance to be worked out by the city and the education department as we move forward. But to bottom line this, the do nothing option leaves you with the logistics that you have now, leaves you with the arrangement, bearing in mind the population shifts that are being forecast, and certainly there's nothing that keeps you from reconfiguring attendance zones to try to balance those out. But you would still be looking at buildings that are woefully undersized based on current guidelines, and a estimated cost net to the city without Kelly of $226 million. Or building 4 elementary schools and keeping the 2 middle schools, completely renovating teachers, a projected cost of $381 million total, and a projected net cost to Norwich at $149 million. And that is not looking at any type of assistance or help from the state in terms of relief for the size of the building or the difference between a renovation grant rate and a new construction grant rate. So we think those are both viable areas that could be considered by the city as you move forward. And that is a half hour of recap of a year or so's worth of work and a pretty big number for everyone to wrap their heads around. So we'll turn it back to you, sir, and take any questions you or your council may have.
I'll start with one quick one, then I'll hand it off. The unspecified cost looking at Kelly moving forward. Any in-depth look at that, or is it, we haven't really asked you to do that, but
We did do that, Mr. Mayor, and we have a projected cost for Kelly, and it turns out probably, if you'll just bear with me, I'll get back to that difference. It is in here just in what's taken out between the two. So the difference there, you're seeing about a $46 million investment in Kelly, and that would be starting about 12 to 14 years from today. That's when your systems in that building would then be approaching 20 years old.
and the reimbursement, if any, varies based on project?
Correct. And with that building, the reason we dropped it out is as you get further out, if you were to move along even moderately close to what we're suggesting, that building we would suggest you consider as a renovation. Lump everything together, keep it working, and put it as a renovation. Once you're out past 20 years, the building qualifies for grants again.
Got it.
So you'll be well past that point when you get back to that building.
Thank you. Members, Alderman Singh.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It's a lot of hard work, and I attended some of the other sessions as well. My question is actually, I don't know if you will be able to answer, but was there any parallel study along with this? If we do this project, how will it affect the overall school budget, operating budget? Because now we are talking about, hopefully, more programs which we can tackle within our school district, which can probably save us some money on transportation cost and some special ed, programs which we can now cater within our school district. Is there any potential saving which we can see if we do this project in an operating budget for the school district?
I think you would anticipate seeing savings in a number of ways. For one, you'll be running far less square footage of buildings, and you'll be running far more energy efficient buildings. So simply on heating, lighting, cooling, you'll pick up quite a bit. One piece that's not in here that the state just adopted is 5 years out, you have to start testing your buildings for indoor air quality. And if your buildings fail, and I'll go so far as to say probably 60% of your buildings are going to fail that, you have 6 months to bring them into compliance. That's a very lightly funded mandate from the state. There's not enough money to fix what's needed in the state. So that's a cost that we can't quantify in here in this, but that's a cost that you need to be fully aware of. That is, that was adopted by the legislature in this past fiscal year. And then programmatic savings, we typically see with new construction across an urban district, outplaced students have a tendency to come back because they're being offered a program that they are not otherwise. In tuition students will go up typically. You may not see as much of that here since your surrounding districts are relatively rural, but the offering of programs by certified professionals in new buildings has an attraction to outlying districts, especially smaller districts that can't provide that type of program in-house. So you might see that. Your range of what's offered would go up. Certainly you have the space for it. That's why we talked about a program that's slightly bigger than the state would allow, because it gives you the ability to build that in. And we also considered pre-K at each one of the buildings, and have not finished a discussion with the school department of whether or not that would be by certified teachers. We assumed it would be, so that you're not imposing upon daycare programs, but you're offering certified teachers at a pre-K level. So I think you would see on operational savings, you'd probably also see bus savings, the logistics, as Jim was describing, of attendance areas that are split, so you've got buses who are crossing one another to get kids from one part of the town to the other, and then buses going the other way. So when you rationalize the attendance areas, you can concentrate the bus routing and simplify that. So I think you would see it in busing costs, operational costs, both heating, cooling, and lighting, or 3. 4 schools gets you potentially some savings, staffing, but probably not at the level that you might think. Running a school within a school is typically a principal and a assistant principal. One would run the school overall and one of the 2 schools internally. So you would still end up, you won't see a net reduction in administrative level. Okay. You might see it in further down in staffing, but I wouldn't look for too much savings there. It'd be operational, and it'd be what you could offer out tuition students coming back and in-tuition students coming in.
Okay, thank you.
President Pro Tem, please.
Thank you. So, I think that the big part of this conversation is going to be, and it's one of the last slides that shows the panel with the do-nothing option versus the build-new option.
At the end.
There you go. So at the last school building committee meeting, the do-nothing option had a price tag of about $160-some million. And you told us at that time that there was no escalation, no inflation, calculated into that. So this new number, this 225, 806, we'll call it $226 million is now, that's been adjusted for over a 20-year span, the escalation in cost of staying with this, or going with this option, I should say, staying with the district as it is now with the improvements. So this is truly an apples to apples comparison now, right, for the community to say, keep what we have and update everything for $226 million, or we go with the build new option, the ultimate cost being just over $149 million.
That's correct. And the other difference to bear in mind with that is for the do-nothing option, we are forecasting 20 years out. For the new build option, we're forecasting for 7. So we can be a bit more accurate there. And you're actually forecasting, about 7, if you do it in 2 phases. The volatility of construction market makes a 20-year escalation factor difficult. So we used 8% for the first 2, and that's compounded annually. So the first 7 years are 8%, and that matches the construction increase. And then after that, we drop down to the historical 5%. So year 7 through year 20 is at 5% compounded.
So then, as an architect that's done, and a firm that's done a number of these types of projects, the quick soundbite is we could have 4 new elementary schools and a completely renovated and larger second middle school for $75 million less than it would be to pour money into the system, the school system that we already have.
That's correct.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Alderman Wilson.
Now, thank you guys again for the work that you guys have done over the course of the months that you have been doing this project. And one of the questions I think you answered it at one of your previous sessions is the do-nothing option also leaves the building, in a sense, the way it is. It's just fixing the systems within the building as is. So we necessarily, and this is more from a programmatic standpoint, if we're looking for a classroom to really be outfitted for a special ed program, it may not necessarily get done in the do-nothing option the way that it needs to be.
That's absolutely right.
So again, going back to the question that Alderman Singh had asked, is this would be one of those things where we would see if we're talking the new build versus the do nothing, it would be harder to bring some of those other programs back or truly cater to the need of some of the specialized programs that we need moving forward.
That's correct. Right now, you have a disproportionate alignment of special ed programs within the schools. That would remain if that is being done for space, which we do believe that's why those programs are where they are. You would not be addressing that at all.
Okay, and then the other question that I wanted to ask is kind of just looking, I mean, I know there's still work to be done on this part, but looking at the playing fields, are those where it has the two different fields, are those more of playgrounds or are those open field spaces?
Those are shown as fields. Playgrounds are right up next to the buildings.
Okay.
And typically what we're looking for are two rectangular fields, one large enough for the older kids to play soccer on and one small enough for the younger kids to go out and recreate. And so they're not on the same field for overlapping times.
Yeah, thank you. And so, I mean, for me, the other part to this is, when we talk about other conversations citywide, this is a chance for our children in the city to not only have the facilities that they need, but, field space for outdoor recreation, use at the school, but even after hours. This is something that we're upgrading, not just on the school side, but also recreationally as a huge asset to the city. So that's the question I have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Other questions, members? Pro Tem, please.
So, a couple of other things I think that were part of our conversation at the last building committee meeting was now that we know the number for the do nothing option, for $75 million less, if we go with the new build options, we achieve two very big goals for the school district. The first is educational equity from a facility standpoint, citywide. Because essentially, we would have 4 elementary schools that are principally the same, and 2 middle schools that are arguably state-of-the-art. I mean, if teachers only meets the standard that Kelly Middle School is setting, that's a quantum leap forward for the middle school on that side of town. The second thing for $75 million less, the second goal that we achieve, is we get an elementary school back on the east side of the town in Greenville, which is one of our most densely populated areas for elementary and middle school aged children. Is that a fair statement?
That's exactly what was making us look over there. The city is an interesting one to plan for because its western part is quite rural and its eastern part is quite urban. And it's almost a dichotomy of trying to address that and achieve parity. You want the learning experience for the student and the teaching experience for the teachers to be the same no matter what building you go to. So when we're at this level, we try to use the same footprint for each site. That's not to say that footprint will get built, but your educational specification that we derive from this would be the benchmark that would say these are the spaces that each building gets. And what we like to do as we move from planning to design is to design buildings that represent their neighborhoods. So the core of it would have all the educational spaces. The aesthetic may be a bit different. But you're looking for parity in the teaching and learning experience, and that is both inside and outside. So back to the question of fields and playgrounds, all of those end up being designed or programmed to the same level to give you that parity across the district. The middle school, we used Kelly as the model for improvement and renovation to teachers. So it made sense to benchmark your building to be the building that you want the second one to have the same spaces in it. So instead of benchmarking it outside of district, we benchmarked it to Kelly.
And 2 more quick things, if I may. The next thing that occurs to me is that when all is said and done, and if we go the new build option, and all the buildings have had their ribbon cutting and the kids are there, we're gonna have at least 3 of our existing buildings that we can either return to the tax rolls or repurpose for some other use that the community wants.
That's correct.
So, you know, to Alderman Singh's question about savings, there's also a revenue piece to that, because anything returns to the tax roll obviously increases our revenue. Or, again, we've heard significant outcry for some sort of a standalone community center. Well, schools can be retrofitted to that need. I mean, we would have options, I guess is my point.
You know, what we did in this program was to take the adult ed program and move it into Huntington, along with all of the district administrative uses. So that would make the newer part of Huntington for adult ed also has a 6,000 square foot gym. And it has some of the better spaces of any of the elementary schools. So that gives you the function of adult ed and community use on that part of town. It gets you out of 2.5 buildings that are being used for administration now and puts it in a single place, makes it much easier for a resident to find what they need. Case already turned over to the transition services. It's a perfect building for that program. And you would end up with Wacquanic, Mahan, veterans would all come offline and be available. Mahan, we understand is quite attractive. Veterans and Wacquanic probably have attractions of their own. And the only caution we give you on those is you need to budget to maintain those buildings until they go to somebody else or a different use. Nothing is worse for a building than to be just shut down. So any budget subsequent to this would have to consider carrying those buildings for not quite operating costs, but to keep them tempered.
But we did discuss the concept of Wacquanic becoming a virtual learning academy and some technology-based learning. So it would. Again, options.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then, and my last thing, and only because I wasn't able to answer the questions, Alderwoman Berto had a couple of questions for me about security within the new build options, school security, student safety, and so on. So I'll yield.
Yes, with this new build, what type of safety are we looking at for our children? I'm just kind of curious, with everything going on in the world, and, you know, that's all you hear about in the news is, you know, I hate to say it, you know, different types of school shootings, and what are we going to do with this new build to keep our children safe? What kind of safety features are we adding to this?
Well, we come at safety and security starting in any planning process. We start out at the street and think about where the building is located relative to the street access. And all of the buildings that we're talking about are pretty close to the street, which restricts the visibility of someone watching someone drive onto site or walk into the building. So we're starting from the street, walking in and looking to develop a building that forms a community for the students and teachers so that people know one another. You know the families that go there. You also have the hard points of security. And I was one of 2 architects who put together the symposium after Sandy Hook. And I was also part of Massachusetts to put together their school security thinking. What Connecticut does is engage with the state police for a review of your planning. And they are looking for every element that relates to someone getting into the building and then potentially moving through the building. What you have somewhat in the buildings right now are just safe vestibules, a place for someone to get out of the weather, but then not get any further. That becomes the critical piece for a safe building, is a place where someone has to talk to an adult, has to talk to someone who knows what's going on, and can't get past that point. It's not so much a matter of doors. You just put a contact sensor on the door, and if it's left open for 3 seconds, an alarm goes off. It's more a matter of getting people into the building in a controlled situation. Visitor parking where it can be seen from the administrator's office, a safe vestibule for entry. And then the back side of the building, appropriate fencing, sight lines, playgrounds located where they should be. You don't want the security of the building to get in the way of a kid enjoying going there. So we're looking for a very secure, very observable entry, and a very secure, very manageable backside.
Okay.
Alderman Singh.
Thank you. So the 3 buildings which will be available for different options, but do we have any appraised value done on those 3 buildings?
We did not, we used.
If we
your-
have to dispose them?
Right, we did not do appraised, we did your tax appraisal is the basis that we used for all the buildings. We did not do market value, what they might sell for. I would imagine in the current market, it's probably a tad more than the assessed value, at least for some of them. So that would be a step that we would suggest you take as you move forward, is to do a market study, look at which buildings might be most attractive, and then use that to set your scheduling for which buildings get built first. Because as you build these, you'll be able to adjust attendance areas. Building 3 buildings for 550 to 600 kids, if those 3 came online in the first phase, you only need 300 seating for 300 kids. So you could almost move out of the elementary school phase pretty quickly. And then the second phase might be teachers and the last elementary school. So the quicker you can get past the elementary schools, the quicker you can get to market with them, either for reuse or sale.
Okay, thank you.
Alderman Gould.
All right, so I'll use Joe's phrase to tie a ribbon around all of this. Sort of in a nutshell, if we spend $226 million, we are only doing maintenance on the buildings that exist right now.
Correct.
We spend $150 million, we have 4 brand-new elementary schools. And I'm particularly pleased that the the old side of the Greenville School works, because I said that right from the get-go, that we should be looking at that site. And I know Pat disagreed with me, and so did Deanna, but I think it's a great idea. But for $150 million, we'll have 4 brand-new schools and a renovated middle school. We have a new administrative offices, so we take John Mason off of line, we take Mahan offline, we definitely take veterans offline, shift around Hickory Street. So we have a lot of buildings that we can dispose of, but we have 4 brand-new elementary schools, and we're saving $75 million. Because the maintenance is going to be the maintenance on these schools that we have now, the existing schools that we have now. And we've deferred maintenance. We are sort of, we're reactive on the maintenance rather than proactive. So I think it's a great plan that you've put together and that we have championed here.
Well, I think one other thing to consider is if you went through with building new and renovating, your maintenance cost to carry those buildings for the next 10 to 15 years is much, much lower than your maintenance cost to continue to carry the existing buildings.
Right.
Because you'll be repairing the existing buildings on over time, which means that the first work you do, by the time you're done with the last work, you're back
You're
to
back
the first
to
work again.
square one again,
Right.
yes. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 things. Thank you. The air quality issue, 5 years down the road, can you send that information to my office, please? And I'll get it out to the rest of the members here. An unfunded mandate like that looming out there will be happening in the middle of this. Will impact people's choices. So I'd like to understand it better. Thank you. The other thing is the pre-K. All schools now have pre-K programs. The city participates in the school readiness program. We get a grant of $2.3 million from the state. I oversee and chair that with public and private providers of pre-K. We got, I believe, 357 daycare slots throughout the city. It's by law, it's supposed to be 50% full day, full year, or 10 hours coverage. School day, school year, 6 hours coverage. That is will have a big impact on that system that exists right now. So I would like to include the school readiness people over at Learn. Linda Allen is our representative there in future correspondence here going forward. I think we're going to need to communicate well with them. And the question about certification, I fully believe that the superintendent right now, if they haven't, they are moving that all teachers in the preschool, even in the private, they want them to be certified. It's a little more difficult on that side of the equation, but we're going to need to communicate well is what I'm getting at.
You said it was Learn who runs that program?
Yeah, Learn out of Groton.
Yep, we know them quite well. We'll reach out to them if that's okay
Yeah.
with you.
Yeah, thank you. Other, yes, Alderman Wilson.
Just, I mean, for me, it's more so, are we able to put this presentation up on the city website? I think it's, as we continue these conversations and we're moving forward with this. You know, a link, I think, it being on their website, but also on the city website, or a link to it,
I think there's a link to it already.
as accessible, go ahead.
The city clerk has received that information, and we'll make sure that that happens. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you, Joe. Any other questions, concerns?
Just a reminder about.
So next
11th.
Monday, we'll see you again, and we're going to have a public presentation. This is for benefit of the council members to further review and sharpen their knowledge. Next Monday, again at 6 o'clock, we'll be here. The public is invited to attend. That is July 11th. The public is invited to ask questions after the presentation. We want to emphasize that. We want them involved, part of the whole discussion. And the goal of the council is then on the 18th to have an opportunity to raise an ordinance for first read and move this forward, because we do have a deadline. This has to be in the hands of the State Secretary of State no later than September 1st if a question is to be placed on the ballot. So this is a tight deadline, but this is why we're being aggressive tonight, next Monday, following Monday, and so forth. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.